Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor today to open this crucial discussion on Europe's defense readiness in the face of an increasingly complex security environment. As we gather here at the École Militaire, we must acknowledge that Europe stands at a crossroads. We face immediate challenges that will define our future security. As you know, high-intensity warfare is back in the European continent, and we must confront the situation alone with urgency and determination. Our discussions today will assess our current state of readiness. We will also seek to identify concrete actions to strengthen European resilience and strategic autonomy. As an introduction, let me rapidly describe the geopolitical landscape. Before 2025, we could characterize international relations by 3D: de-Westernization, disorganization of international relations, and disinhibition of all our competitors. First, de-Westernization. Because the West no longer attracts, its model is contested. Because Global South is a reality for countries which antagonize with the West. And finally, because our competitors exploit the fragmentation of our societies and our alliances. Secondly, disorganization of international relations, because the end of the Pax Americana marks the end of happy globalization, because the United Nations is no longer the guarantor of the international order, and finally, because some P5 members challenge all the rules underpinning the international system. Finally, disinhibition of our competitors, because the fields of conflicts are widening beyond traditional bounds, and because some powers no longer hesitate to impose themselves by force. In February 2022, you remember, high-intensity warfare returned to the European continent under the cover of an aggressive nuclear sanctuarization. And I could add that before 2025, there was also a strong mistrust of the concept of European strategic autonomy. But 2025 is a game changer. The game changer of 2025 is the major shift of the American policy under the Trump administration. It is my fourth D, the decoupling of the United States from Europe. We knew it was going to happen, but not so quickly and not so brutally. Let me remind you of the sequence of events we've seen through recently. On February 14, J.D. Vance called into question the founding values of the West and announced a shift from burden sharing to burden shifting. On February 21, we all witnessed Donald Trump's show of strength against Vladimir Zelensky in the Oval Office. On February 26, Donald Trump announced a 25% tariff on European steel and aluminium. On March 4, the end of military aid to Ukraine was announced. It has been established today. Finally, on March 5, the United States announced the end of intelligence supplies to Ukraine. It seems that it has been restored today. This sequence is in line with the logic of the new American administration. Here are the main trends or threats. America first. The United States should focus on domestic issues. A sort of reversal of alliances. We face a new American imperialism. It regards the claims of Russian imperialism as legitimate and Europe as its vassals. A geographical vision of areas of influence. Greenland, Canada, and Panama Channel are in the American area, just as Ukraine is in the Russian area. A commercial and transactional approach to international relations. The almost signed one-sided agreement on rare earth is a perfect example. The primacy of strength over the law, the end of value-based diplomacy in favor of diplomacy of constraints, of intimidation, or of the deal. And finally, the core role of Donald Trump, who is unpredictable. So, what are the consequences for us? Let us start with the war in Ukraine. My personal analysis is that we should expect the United States to put maximum pressure on the Ukrainian side, over which it has the most leverage. And we have seen yesterday. We can also expect the establishment of a direct dialogue with the United States and Russia, with marginalization of Ukraine and European countries. It's still ongoing. At the political level, there is also an increased risk of regime change in Ukraine, with perhaps a pro-Russian administration taking over the country after biased election. Finally, if a real ceasefire can be achieved, or a peace agreement, I don't know, we could expect also a massive rearmament by Russia during the 3 or 5 upcoming years. With its war economy, Russia will be able to jeopardize our security in the long term. It will also be able to resume combats or to invade another country, such as Baltic countries, Moldavia, at the end of the Trump presidency. So the obvious consequence of this rapid analysis is that Europe should react. It should react rapidly and strongly. European countries are now up against the wall. They need to take control of their own security, not tomorrow, but right now. In doing so, they should also bear in mind that the balance of power is largely in Europe's favor against Russia. First, whatever happens, Europe will need to rationalize its military capabilities. This will require a drastic change in mindset by accepting shared orders and restructuring our European defense industrial base. Secondly, in order to rearm, European countries will resort massively to additional resources. The Rearm European Plan, unveiled by Ursula von der Leyen, will provide EU 150 billion of loans to member states for defense investment and activates the national escape clause of the Stability and Growth Pact. Thirdly, the EU and NATO must work together in a complementary way. European capability efforts must converge with NDPP objectives. The European Commission's white paper, to be published on March 19th, aims to achieve this objective. Over the next 3 years, we need to deploy sufficient forces and demonstrate sufficient political will to ensure that Russia can never again exploit our weaknesses by resorting to a fait accompli. Fourthly, we have to keep in mind that the nature of war has changed. We are living the unrestricted war described by Wang Yangxi and Qiu Liang, two Chinese colonels, or later by Valery Gerasimov in slightly different terms. This calls for a moral rearmament of our societies as part of the global defense is at stake. Military, but also above all, civil. It's not T-80 tanks that threaten Paris, but hybrid attacks on our economy, on our infrastructure, and on our societies. Europe's resilience depends on the resilience of each of its citizens. We must protect ourselves from these insidious threats with our Russian counterparts mastered to perfections. Finally, President Macron opens the sensitive question of the European dimension of French nuclear deterrence. That will be a parameter of the future European defense. Now, what about NATO? For a long time, NATO thought that the European Union could do nothing for it. This is now changing. This is changing notably since G.D. Vance announced the transition from burden sharing to burden shifting. This shift to European countries is giving a crucial role of the European pillar of NATO. Tomorrow, it could become the backbone of NATO. The United States could announce less involvement in NATO at the June summit in The Hague. In a worst-case scenario, it could even be its departure. What is certain is that Donald Trump will hold NATO countries to account. He will condition and adjust his support according to the effort made by European countries. As a conclusion, the return of high-intensity conflict is a wake-up call. It is no longer a question of whether Europe must prepare. It is a question of how quickly and effectively we can do so. Our discussions today are not just theoretical. The questions we ask and the solutions we propose will shape the future of European security. We must be proactive, realistic, and committed to strengthening our ability to act swiftly and decisively. I invite you all to engage openly and constructively in today's discussions. The challenges ahead demand clear thinking, strong partnership, and above all, action. Thank you. Now I give the floor to somebody, or
yes,
or perhaps there was
we
some.
can choose. No.
Okay.
As a first panel.
Okay. Thank you.
That sounds like a starting buzzer, so I think that's good to go. Well, this is all very casual, so I do feel we ought to have a bit of red wine sat on this table, so we can just casually lean on tables and talk to you. But so I'll introduce myself. So I will be the moderator. I'm Commander Edward Black. So I'm in the Royal Navy, but I'm working at Russie for a year, and part of the, or maybe 18 months, but part of the beauty of being at Russie is Russie has this relationship with École de Guerre, which is why Russie has provided the moderators for the next 3 panels. I would like to welcome in turn, we got Major General retired François-Marie Goujon, NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Defence and Policy Planning. We've got Hannah Vargon, Head of DGRS European Union Desk, also from DGRS. And then we have Charles Litchfield, the Deputy Director and C. Boyden Gray Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Centre. And that's a mouthful. So this panel will be run slightly differently to some of them you might have seen over the last couple of days, in that I will ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and give a short opening. Previously, you may have seen people who've done a good 10, 11, 12 minutes each. So it'll be a short opening each, in the hope that we can then move into some directed questions, so that will be more of an informal cafe table-based debate and chat. And then, of course, there'll be the opportunity to open up to questions, and then there'll be a short roundup at the end. One slight reminder is the fact that there are 3 panels. This first one is talking about unity and strength in Europe and military partnerships. The second one looking more at defence capabilities and scale, and the third one looking at mobilisation. So if you have a question that is more pertinent to the later ones, please save it to them rather than just throwing them all at this panel, noting the difference in focus. So I would also draw your attention to, actually, even though I don't speak French very well, I have noticed that the titles in English and French are slightly different. So in French, it's anchored at political alliances, and I think that's probably going to be where we will end up looking mostly in this first panel. I think that's it's a much better phrase in French than it is in English. So we've just heard how we are cursed to live in interesting times, and I would just, by way of introduction, say that I was very taken with the opening speeches, particularly by the Minister of Defence from the Netherlands, who said to those of you in the European Union, don't be modest. He also said that the European Union should work with the British and the Norwegians, which I was glad to hear. And then there was a panel later in the day where we were chastised for not including Turkey in that list of people that with whom the EU should be working. So a little bit of food for thought before I pass it over. So with no further ado, sir.
Ed, thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon to you all. I think my job is pretty much done. Eric said it all, so I'll just pass the floor. I mean, since we had the French general in the room using the words NATO and NDPP, and 5 years, I can tell you that 5 years ago or 10 years ago, it wouldn't have been the case, or it would have been quite unlikely, because no one knew what NDPP was about in the NATO defense planning process. But Eric, just to build on what you just said, I will just kick off this conversation by touching on 3 main observations in 1 or 2 minutes, and I'll be very happy to further elaborate in the course of the conversation. 3 observations. The first one is, in terms of, well, the NATO-EU cooperation that precisely you were calling for, in full complementarity of both organizations, I can tell you that, and I think Stacey also here can confirm, that this is actually happening every day. So it's not only that our leadership, Secretary General Rutte, but also President von der Leyen are sitting with other European leaders in the same meetings regarding the future of security in Europe, but also in terms of cooperation between organizations. We have regular talks and staff to staff, but even at high level, on topics such as the alignment of priorities with DG Defis on which priorities they should channel the money that they hope to raise in support of strengthening deterrence and defense in Europe. It's also an ongoing cooperation with DG Move in terms of supporting military mobility, because that's absolutely essential for the enablement of our operational plans in Europe in order to make sure that the force flow can happen at speed of relevance, as we say. So we have this ongoing cooperation with DG Move on the future projects that they aim to support, but it's also more a broader dialogue in terms of building up the resilience of the European society as part of the EU preparedness plan in complementarity with what we do in NATO. So this cooperation is quite unprecedented, has really picked up momentum in the past 6 months, clearly, and we are already at a way more advanced stage than we were like a year ago. So this is already happening. Point number 2, as rightly said, in terms of the relationship that we have with our big allies, the US, it was absolutely clear, and in public and private conversations that we have with our American partners, that they have reinforced, reconfirmed their commitment to NATO and to Article 5. So this has never been questioned in any way in our conversations with them. Nevertheless, it's absolutely clear also that that was the new US SecDef Texas making it very clear to allies at the last defense ministers meeting that they expect the Europeans to take a bigger share. As you say, it's burden shifting more than burden sharing today. So they expect Europeans not only to take a bigger share of European security, but also to take on more responsibility in that regard. So it's not only recommitment, but also a clear expectation for things to happen quickly and in very concrete terms. And this will be very likely front and center in the discussions at the upcoming summit in The Hague. And the last point I would like to highlight is, as much as we sometimes would like to get carried away by the enthusiasm of the moment, because it's a big awakening of Europe, security in Europe, or European security, I think it's important to know where we come from, and also to remember that in terms of collective defense, and for a number of reasons that I'll be very happy to expand on later, NATO will not be easily replaced, because collective defense builds on collective commitments, but also structures, but also workforce, but also plans, but also processes, that it would be extremely unrealistic to think that they could be easily replaced. So NATO is very likely to remain the provider of collective defense for the Euro-Atlantic area, potentially with a bigger European pillar in it. So the direction of travel that we're looking at today is certainly not building new institutions, but building a stronger European footprint in NATO by using the flexibility that the alliance allows us to have, either collectively or through overlapping groupings on regional basis sometimes. And I will just leave it as that. Just leave it there. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So as it's written here, I'm head of the European Union department, so I will speak, of course, about the European Union. And as it has been said already, it is an important moment today for European defense. And for example, this afternoon, there is a meeting of the defense ministers of 5 different countries here in Paris, a few minutes away from here. The ministries of France, UK, Germany, Italy, and Poland to speak about European defense and the situation in Ukraine, which shows how it is important and how we are tackling the issue. And European Union, although an old alliance, was never about defense, never had a focus on defense. But as it's often said, the European Union changes through crisis. And we can safely say that we are going through a crisis right at the moment. And the European Union has added value on defense. Its added value is, of course, about the defense industry, as the European Union has competencies on industry, but also on the resilience or the reaction to hybrid threats. And so far, European Union doesn't have many tools regarding defense. There are only a few of them, not much. There is a European Defense Fund that supports research and innovation for industrial projects in defense. There are some projects on military mobility, so to make sure that troops can move freely across Europe. And then outside of the EU budget, there is a common security and defense policy, so EU can launch operations and missions outside of its territory. And lastly, the European Peace Facility, which is a tool to finance initiatives related to defense, but in other countries. And that's the tool that was used as well for Ukraine to help Ukraine either financially or with equipment. So it's not much, and it's clearly not enough, because the EU will have to take its part regarding the rearmament of Europe. And so far, it doesn't work. I believe, in 3 points as well, that the European Union has 3 challenges. The first one is unity, because there are 27 countries in the EU, and there are 27 different priorities regarding defense, and they are hard to align. And we saw that even recently, because Hungary, for example, blocked different initiatives regarding to Ukraine. The second challenge would be the repartition of competences. Defense is an attribute of a sovereign state. Yet the Commission is taking a bigger role, and it's a good thing because we need it. So, for example, the Commission is publishing a white paper on the future of defense next week, probably. So it shows how the Commission and the European institutions are taking the subject of defense, but it also shows that we need to find the right balance between the role of the member states, because defense is their role, and the role of the European institutions. And the last challenge is the relation with NATO, as you mentioned. There is no point for EU to replace NATO. It doesn't work like this. EU is not a military alliance, which NATO is, of course. But we still need to improve the relation between the two organizations, and we also need to redefine the role of the states that are part of the alliance and part of the European Union, because this will be what will be needed. This is what will be needed for the conflicts to come.
Thank you very much. So Charles Litchfield, as you see, I'm an economist working at the Atlantic Council, so one might be wondering what I'm doing on this panel. At least the Atlantic Council does have views on transatlantic cooperation and cooperation within Europe, and so I'll try to represent the views of my colleagues as best I can. But also, as also my co-panelist was saying, a lot of this does have an economic and an industrial policy component, so I'll try to touch on that as well. I'm the only member of this panel who lives in Washington, D.C., so it would be remiss of me not to talk about the atmosphere and the current debate going on, or lack thereof, because one of the most striking factors of the characteristics of the Trump presidency, as it's now in its second or third month, is that there isn't that much pushback yet. So the Democratic Party is criticizing Trump, but not really in the sort of vocal way you might expect. And I think part of that is allowing him to fail on his own terms rather than providing him with a target. So I think there has been some disappointment in Europe that there hasn't been that much pushback against some of the more egregious things that the Trump administration has said about European defense, about the old transatlantic alliance. I think we should at least see it in this context of the Democrats not necessarily having changed their position completely, and the Republican Party still containing some people who are committed to European defense, but a kind of political play to allow some of Trump's more eccentric ideas to fail on their own terms. But there are dangers in this too, because it creates chaos, and there isn't really that much resisting the chaos. So the General mentioned Secretary Hegseth's speech, which was somewhat alarming to Europeans, but certainly not as bad as the Vance speech. So there are different camps, even within Trump world. There is the camp that wanted redeployment, so fewer troops in the European theater, allowing the US to concentrate on the Chinese threat. That certainly would be, I think, Hegseth's point of view, Elbridge Colby's point of view, who is the current nominee to be Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. But I think I'm not taking too many risks by saying that this camp is a little bit disappointed by the internal chaos they see in the own administration, the administration they have joined. And I think they wouldn't say this in public, but they realize that if this administration is going to be the one that will redeploy forces to Asia and provide a deterrent to China for entering Taiwan, the sort of behavior that we've seen, and the behavior specifically with Ukraine, does not suggest that the US will be a reliable support for Taiwan in such a scenario. So there is some disappointment, not that they express it publicly. And then the other camp is the sort of isolationist Vance camp that does feel quite strongly that that doesn't really care so much about the old transatlantic alliance, and even kind of enjoys provoking Europeans and using language that we all find kind of unpleasant. So this is what we're dealing with. This is the reality of this important partner and where they are, at least for the coming years. I do think, and I agree with my fellow panelists, that it doesn't make NATO irrelevant or obsolete in any way. There is a lot of inertia in the US system still keeping an interest in Europe, not least the presence of 60,000, I think, US military troops. Higher, apologies. It might go down a little bit soon, but certainly many. And there are interests the US has in staying in Europe as, you know, a logistical advantage in being Europe to serve some of the operations that they have to get involved in the Middle East. I think Israel feels quite strongly that it wants the US presence to remain in Europe because it is logistical support for supporting Israel. So there is also an inertia in this relationship which does keep the US in, I think, and so the more alarmist scenarios where they completely pull out, I think, are exaggerated. But I thought it was important to provide that picture. 2 more points that I'll make very briefly, because then we want to come back to the debate. On the European step up, my fellow panelists have already mentioned the initiatives that are already there for the EU to promote innovation, to promote better work together, but it's not enough. The budgetary side of it just isn't strong enough. So rearm EU, which the General mentioned earlier, for now the biggest plank of it is simply allowing countries to use the national escape clause and therefore use more deficit spending to get to 2% or higher on defense. I think there is a debate also about a common new instrument and new debt at the European level. We'll see where it goes in the next few months, but I think this is not something that should be ignored. I think that will be a big, big step, and it isn't impossible, which is a big change from before. Crucial point also connects with some of the things Hannah was saying. Not all countries can participate in this. There are countries that are not part of NATO but are part of the EU. There are countries that for ideological reasons will not participate, like Hungary. So this is also an opportunity because it will be intergovernmental. So it can include countries like the UK, Ed, but also Turkey, Norway. These could also be included in this initiative because it is intergovernmental. So there may be still a secretariat, or it may be based in Brussels, but it does not make it impossible for there to be non-EU participation. We do have to be careful about this, though, because as the EU promotes new initiatives on defense industrial capacity that are in Europe and not elsewhere, reducing our reliance on the US, it might come across as slightly provocative to include like-minded countries like Canada, the UK, Japan, Norway, but not the US. So one of the reasons the March 2024 European Defense Industrial Strategy specifically talked about the EU and was kind of light in language on including the UK is that you can't really go all in on including all like-minded partners except for the US. Now, given how the US is behaving, one would understand that type of priority, but it's quite difficult. I think this is one of the tensions we need to manage. The final thing I want to say is on France, where we are hosting this wonderful forum. Thank you very much. This is France's moment in many ways, and I think certainly my personal view is that we're lucky to have a country like France that has promoted for a longer time than others views on strategic autonomy or open strategic autonomy. It is important, and as someone who knows France well but often observes from the outside, dealing with the perceptions that other partners have of France. That France uses the EU as a vehicle for its own power, that France is promoting its own economic interests through common defense funds or using EU lending to promote only its companies. I certainly don't think this is true. I think the criticism is often unfair, but these are perceptions that are there and that we have to deal with. I'll stop there.
That sounds like my introduction. I do feel I should do like a ballet step to come into that. But thank you very much for all those wonderful opening pieces. I'd like to, in the spirit of the fact that we're going to be talking about unity, to come back to your points, Hannah, on unity, and noting that it's probably easier to get it than it was when we were part of the team, but you're welcome. So unity is hugely important, and it seems almost unprecedented the degree to which unity has been found. President von der Leyen's rearm policy was seemingly adopted without a murmur, even though, as we've heard, there are some questions about rearming through debt. Is that necessarily a sustainable way forward? So my question is, we've got unity at the moment, but that's probably because the Americans have just done shock and awe. When that shock and awe starts to die down a bit, where do you see the likely fracture points within Europe? Where are the key tectonic shifts that could endanger the unity that we're sort of basking in at the moment? And you can fight amongst yourselves.
Yeah, I would say the fracture point that we see already and that we might see in the future as well is really regarding the relation to the United States, because the United States is still, of course, Europe's ally, and because we have two different, let's say, two different issues. On one side, we have Russia. We need short-term rearmament, which means that we need the United States. So we need to buy United States equipment and materials and armament. And this is a push from a lot of countries, especially in the eastern side of Europe, with, of course, understandable reasons, being neighbor to Russia. And then on the other side, we have other countries such as France that are more pushing for the long-term vision, saying we need to have autonomy, we need to be independent as much as we can be, of course, from other countries outside of the European Union, which means we mean to strengthen our defense industry, our defense in general, and which means that we need to cut ties or limit our ties with other countries. And for me, this difference between short-term and long-term is a fracture that exists already and that will continue because both sides are right, in a way. You can't say to Polish people that they should think in the long term and not think about Russia. And then on the other side, the Western countries are also right in saying that this is a long run and that it won't be resolved in a few years, and that's why we also need to think in the long term, and we need to think about our strategic autonomy. So I would say that's a line of fracture that already exists, but will deepen.
I can certainly echo that from a Paul Mill perspective. As we're now building up our defensive capabilities and our defensive posture, or our deterrence posture, it's good also that you all can see already some lines, some cracks, or some dividing lines. I mean, they've always been there between regional groupings of nations, depending on how far they sit from Russia, obviously, which has, of course, an impact on the perception by their opinions, and then, therefore, not only on their readiness to spend more on defense, but also to commit forces in support of other allies. And so, I mean, fully agree with what you just explained in terms of political perceptions, but this might be become more acute if the threat increases and all of a sudden public opinions realize that the place of their armed forces in the plans of NATO is not something that they are ready to support. If you look, for instance, at Spain, Spain has decided to take on the responsibility of a framework nation for a core level, so in the land domain, for Hungary and Slovakia. I'm not entirely sure that the public opinion in Spain is fully aware of this, and in case of an incident, would be absolutely ready to support this and to support the fact that their troop could be exposed in that region. And the same goes for other regions. So you have regional groupings of interest, and there is a non-insignificant risk that if NATO does not manage to, with the support of member states and allies, to maintain the cohesion of Europe, the fallback option, the easy fallback option for nations would be to go for regional sub-alliances. So you're seeing that with the Nordic states, you're seeing that with the Baltic and the Baltic states and Poland, you're seeing that with the Eastern nations, you're seeing that with the Southern nations, and this whole construct of drawing together around a sense of common responsibility in front of a common threat that NATO has been able to build over the past 50 years could simply go away in a few weeks in case threats start to materialize. So that's not only a matter of investment, defense investment, it's not only a matter of public perceptions, it's also the exposure to the reality of a threat becoming more acute in what we think could be less than a decade span of time.
Some very interesting points there. And I just wonder, following up, there was a panelist this morning, the Admiral, he said that sometimes France is accused of having had one foot in and 1 foot out of NATO, and he assured us that actually, no, they've definitely got both feet in NATO. However, it's probably true to say that France's attitude to NATO has been perhaps a little more circumspect than others. And therefore, the question is, does that mean the paradigm shift that France is having to face is somewhat less than some of the other countries, and perhaps for those new joiners like Sweden, who've traditionally been just arming themselves against Russian threat for decades, outside of NATO, albeit now they're in it. So perhaps the paradigm shift is less to them. So I just wondered if you could expand on those rather naive observations on my part and give some real expertise.
That's probably more useful. I think your question boils down to is how do you measure commitment? And I think you have, 32 allies and with 30 different versions of their own national commitment. Of course, France has a specific place in the alliance, of course, given the recent history, but also given the fact that it's part of the founding nations of the alliance. It is a nuclear nation. It's part of the P5. It's part of the P3. And so whatever the position of France, it cannot be ignored. And so although I would not overplay the importance of France coming back into the integrated military structure some decade ago, 2 decades ago, almost now, where it sits and how it's perceived actually matters for the others in a very peculiar way. I think the way you measure commitment, from what I can see certainly in my discussions with the different capitals, is the amount of risk you are really willing to take, of actual risk beyond lip service, that you are actually willing to take to demonstrate solidarity. And not all nations are actually willing to do this, especially depending on the position where you will put your forces. So I think beyond public declarations, the fact that France accepted already some time ago to be a framework nation, a part of the framework nation in Estonia, and in the early part of the 8 framework nations for the enhanced forward presence, so dating back to already 2014, 16, I think. The fact that it is now a framework nation in Romania, with troops stationed there permanently and ready to fight. The fact that France was actually able to deploy the VJTF back in March 22, so just after the full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, I think was a clear demonstration of its commitment, and clearly it's the way that it was perceived, both in Estonia, in Romania, and by the rest of the allies. I mean, we put our money where our money was, or the other way around, I can't recall. But clearly, that was something that was really received in a way that demonstrated a change of tone. I would say also that the way it is carried out, meaning that when you deploy troops, the question is what it is exactly that you deploy. Are you deploying flags? So is it just for a nice parade on a field with like 15 flags from different nations and that's it? Or do you actually deploy combat-ready forces with the right kits that they need and the amount of ammunition they need to sustain a fight for 30 days? And that does make a difference, and I can tell you that not all framework nations are equal in that matter. And the way France did it was also well perceived and well received by the nations who we are in partnership with. So, I mean, long story short, I think the political commitments are one thing, actual commitments in the field with soldiers ready to take risks and politicians ready to assume that risk is another thing. And I think where we sit today, or where France sits today, is quite different to where it sat a decade ago.
I just have a few remarks that may seem quite scattered, but on the French commitment to NATO, I don't think, certainly in Washington, D.C., this isn't really disputed. This is seen as very firm, and France is often seen as the most crucial partner on some things the US has done recently. So that's not where what you said is very important, but it's not necessarily where I think the perception issue is. The perception issue recently, though it has improved, has been in the countries you've mentioned, on the eastern flank, which have misremembered or misunderstood sometimes remarks made by French leaders concerning NATO. So everyone remembers the brain-dead remark made about NATO by President Macron. Not everyone remembers, although I think everyone in this room who's very well informed would not make this mistake, but not everyone remembers that he was talking about Turkey, not about Russia. And often when I've asked, as a sort of facetious joke, asked military attachés in Washington if they remember the context in which this remark was made, they do not remember it was about Turkey. So all they heard was brain dead and not the rest. So there's a problem about sort of strategic communications there, and I think France has done a lot of work to improve on this. But I think that is one problem. Even if it's unfair, even if it isn't what he meant, that is what was remembered. And hopefully we've made some progress since then.
Just one point. I think, just to comment on this, I think the Globsec declaration by President Macron also put very much the brain-dead statement to rest, with the majority of the nations concerned. So I think we've seen, to me, this point is very much behind us now. I mean, that's the feeling I have.
Thank you. I think I would like to take this opportunity to make use of the fact that we have someone that's not military on, or who hasn't been working on the military matters on the panel to ask, because everyone likes to know what America's thinking, and this is about as close as we're going to get, I think. So if Europe manages to unite in the way that we're hoping it might, in the call to arms that we heard, as I said, from the Minister of Defence from the Netherlands, and does manage to mobilise effectively, at what point does the EU become a threat that Trump actually reacts against?
Well, he's already called the EU something that was built up to screw the United States, so we're already there. But it wasn't about defense; it was about economics in general. But I think this is a very good question, and I am a U.S. citizen, accent notwithstanding. So, yeah, I am the American citizen of the panel. It doesn't sound like it. So, I think we are already in this scenario where U.S. defense contractors can now perceive the threat and are wondering how best to calibrate their message to the Trump administration that some of the some seemingly erratic decisions that have been taken over the past few weeks over whether or not we're sharing intelligence with Ukraine, whether or not some of the weapons that have been shared with Ukraine will even work in the next few weeks, that this is, in even the medium term, bad for the export prospects of US defense producers. I think it will take time for that message to get back into the Trump system, but they are certainly very worried about it. What will reassure them, though, is that there is a lot of inertia in Europe. Building up Europe's industrial defense capacity will take time, and there is still a perception, a very entrenched perception in European capitals, that buying American also curries favor with US administrations. Now, this has seemingly been somewhat disproved in the past few weeks, but my experience talking to people quite high up in European governments, not this one, not the French one, but others, is that this is still not the time to reconsider F-35's purchases for some. So sorry, France, but it's still not the time. And even with the minister of a country that has been threatened by annexation by the US recently, part of its territory, there is no debate, really. And you have to understand, because they have a delivery schedule that's planned for their F-35s, and so they're going to go ahead along with it. It would also be a provocation to cancel them. But it just shows you how far the path dependency we've gone in. And there's still a lot of things that we will be buying from the US in the next few years. So the actual turning the corner and the feeling that US defense contractors are actually losing market share may take a bit of time. Although in the markets, you already see that European defense contractors are doing well, or the defense producers are doing well, and American ones aren't. It'll take a bit of time to turn the corner, but my personal view is that the quotas that may seem a little bit inflexible in the European defense industrial base strategy are necessary. They may need a little bit more flexibility, including the United Kingdom and others might be a good idea, but they are a necessary component of making Europe more strategically autonomous. And even I'm comfortable saying that.
Just to say, it's always a time to switch and reconsider F-35 and switch to Rafale, of course. Do not listen to the American in the room. And it's always funny in a way to hear EU being seen as a threat, because when you work in the EU, for the EU, you just see the inertia, the problems, the bickerings, the 27 that never agree on anything. And yeah, thinking that this is a threat to anyone is actually, when you're inside of it, quite funny, although when you're outside, of course, it's different. But I would say that the EU is not a threat regarding defense industry, for example, because we actually have the same problems as the United States. We are all in the global system, in globalization, and we have the same problems in terms of absorption capacity of the defense spendings and the capacity of production as well. So just like the United States, there are a lot of people buying weapons these days, and actually we are not autonomous. The European base, defense, industrial and technological base, and the American one are really linked, and they can't work without each other. Even though even though France is pushing, of course, a lot for strategic autonomy, even though it is attainable at some point, so far it is not the case, and it is not desirable, because that's the whole point of globalization. It's really that the countries work together, or the powers work together, so that they don't go at war against each other. And I'm not saying at any point that European Union is going to go at war against the United States, but this is also our way to anchor the United States to Europe. So that's why I would say it's really not a threat.
Just on 10, 20 seconds. I'm starting to work on a study on just this exactly. So we're all very worried and concerned in Europe, and I am still more European than I am American, of course, about the dependency not just on US defense exports, but also the inputs, the components, and some of this. Even the components sometimes have ITAR implications, which is a problem. But it does work in the other way, and there is a huge dependency on the US side on defense components and inputs that you might even necessarily think of as defense, defense inputs, but that are extremely precise, extremely good, and can't be replaced. And often they come from French and German SMEs. I don't think this has been factored in the Trump administration's trade policy, but it is the truth, and we're working on a study to demonstrate it.
So just to make sure that we're not stealing too many of the industry-type questions that might come up later, so we're not in the habit of eating other people's sandwiches, I'd just like to bring us back onto the unity piece. So if Europe is going through a period of unity against in uncertain times, just wonder, are there other parties outside of Europe? We've touched briefly on UK and Norway, UK especially, obviously, go UK. Perhaps thinking about Turkey, but also others